Good morning to everybody. Welcome to the National Coal Transportation Association's webinar on a whole bunch of issues that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now. I'm John Ward. I'm the Executive Director of NCTA, and we're pleased to be able to do this webinar in conjunction with the Freight Rail Customer Alliance and our friends at the National Rural Electric Cooperatives Association. Recent STB and U.S. congressional actions and what they mean to you. To say that things are busy on the transportation front in Washington, D.C. right now is a huge understatement. There's a lot of moving parts, and we want to do our best to give you a view of what all those are. We've got two very good speakers with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're going to hold questions until the end. But if you have questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box and we'll accumulate those so that our speakers can answer them at the end of the program or wait till the end of the program and you can unmute yourselves at that point and have a conversation. We do invite people to keep their computers, their Zoom links on mute while the presentation is going on, just to avoid any of that background noise like my dog barking, which happens all the time. Let me introduce our speakers. We're very pleased to have Emily Regas as our kickoff speaker here. Emily's the Fuel Services Manager for Arizona Electric Power Cooperative. She's got over 20 years experience in this area. She has been our president at NCTA since 2009. She also serves as vice president of the Freight Rail Customer Alliance and is a member of the Surface Transportation Board's Rail Energy Transportation Advisory Committee, representing the cooperative utilities on that body. Emily has been up to her ears involved in all the things that are going on at STB and will be able to give us a good overview of what's happening there. Also joining us will be Ann Warner. Ann is the coordinator for the Freight Rail Customer Alliance. She's also a consultant to us here at NCTA. She's got deep background in Washington, D.C., has held corporate positions with Arcadis and Bechtel. She's worked with associations at the Airports Council and the International Bridge Tunnel and Turnpike Association. She's also got Hill experience working for former Representative Ken Kramer of Colorado and Phil Crane of Illinois. So we're very pleased to have Ann and her experience here to both guide us and today explain to us what's going on. So with those introductions, again, as we move forward, please feel free to send us any questions you have in the chat box. But let's get started and I'll kick it over to you, Emily.
Hey, thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. You may have noticed there's been some major supply chain issues going on these days, and many of you probably have firsthand experience of the urgent issues in freight rail service that we're going to talk about. But first, I want to give you some background on how this came about, and then we'll talk about the activities of the Surface Transportation Board and what the actions of the STB mean for you as a coal or coal-related commodity shipper. And then we'll talk about how NCTA and FRCA have been engaged in the rail service public policy debate on behalf of their membership. So utility coal burns have been increasing since early 2021. This is a chart from Energy Ventures analysis from their May 2022 stockpile report. It shows the trend of gas prices and coal burns since about April 2017. You can see that red line going up off the right-hand side of the chart. There were some volatile periods early on, but then we had somewhat of a downward trend in coal burns through the pandemic in 2020. And then in early 2021, we see coal burns are going up and staying up, and the gas prices going up too as the country started to recover from the pandemic. So the demand for coal impacted coal stockpiles, and according to this chart, coal stocks reached a high point during 2020, but then they began steadily decreasing. And that's something we typically see when natural gas prices go up, more coal gets purchased and consumed, and then days of coal burn inventory on the ground at the utilities starts to shrink. So coal inventory now in the spring of 2022 is an all-time low. And because we ship coal primarily by rail, we look at railroad metrics to see what is going on when commodities and coal supplies are slow to deliver. And this slide shows the 2-year trend of average train velocity of the 4 Class 1 railroads. Starting with about March 2020, we start to see the train velocity decrease at about a 7% year-over-year average. And terminal dwell time, and that terminal dwell time line is inverted for comparing year over year. Terminal dwell time is up 8% on a 4-week basis. So the takeaway here is that train velocity decreased at about the same rate as terminal dwell time increased. So at NCTA, we're always looking for ways to provide more value to the membership. And one of the things we came up with a couple of years ago is the on-time performance survey. And we've observed that the railroad data that they report is not always useful information to shippers. And shippers need a way to quantify the railroad service data with their own railroad performance service metrics. So we came up with a survey to try to collect railroad service data from the shipper perspective. And it's been a very useful tool, logistics and planning tool for shippers. Like-kind service routes for the various coal regions to different utilities within the similar mileage distances. And we've been able to collect this data for a couple of years now. It's all voluntary information by members of the NCTA and FRCA and NRECA members. Identity is protected. We never reveal who the shippers are. And we've been using the results of the data in our discussions with the Surface Transportation Board and the Government Accountability Office. And lately, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Railroads, as they seek input from shippers and shipper organizations on all the various rail service issues. And we continue to send out the survey to members every 6 months. We collect this information. The survey will come out again about the end of July, and we'll collect data from the first half of 2022. So the survey results in the second half of 21 were very interesting in regards to railroad service. We had just a few data points here. We collected data from 28 different plants. 92% reported that they were having rail service issues that impacted their utility operations. 60% reported rail service was worse than it was in 2019 and 2020. And 64% reported they had to modify their plant operations in 2021 due to the rail service issues that were affecting their coal delivery. And the results of the survey from the second half of 21, we asked several different questions about utility operations and how they were impacted by railroad service issues. And so you can see by the responses that the coal inventory stockpiles have been greatly affected. More than 80% of the respondents reported rail service issues were affecting them. And almost 60% said rail service had been deteriorating. 60% also had to implement coal unit curtailment efforts to conserve coal inventory. And about 50% said their coal supply commitments were not being met and that rail car maintenance was also being affected. And 50% also reported they were restricted from adding more train sets, and almost 20% reported some of their train sets had to be parked. So this data, as I said before, has been very useful in our discussions with the STB and the Government Accountability Office as more shippers reach out for help or called attention to their concerns about reliability of the grid and their ability to obtain coal supply. So now I want to turn things over to Ann Warner, who's going to tell you more about the STB and the activities on Capitol Hill.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar today. Appreciate everyone's time and the good representation of those of you from both NCTA and FRCA and NRECA membership. So thank you very much. So why do we spend so much time focusing on the Surface Transportation Board? Who are they and what do they do? Well, it was created in 1995 to replace the Interstate Commerce Commission. And it basically consists of 5 members. Currently, there are 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and each individual is nominated by the president, and it requires consent and confirmation by the US Senate. So each position is for a 5-year term, a fixed term, with an optional 1-year holdover. And there is the opportunity for that same individual to be nominated again for a second 5-year term and again with a 1-year holdover year. So depending upon the configuration of the board, it's a reflection of which party is in the White House as to who is chairman. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But the STB is basically to provide economic regulation or economic oversight of providers of interstate land and water transportation. So particularly for our group, it would be the freight railroads. This is the only agency that does have jurisdiction over railroad rate, practice, and service issues and rail restructuring transactions, mergers, sales, construction, and abandonments. So unlike other transportation providers in the United States, all of the authority really rests with the Surface Transportation Board, unlike the Department of Justice for other modes of transportation. Then the Staggers Act of 1980, it actually changed the function and the purpose of the railroads, where now the railroads were to focus on freight service providers and not passenger rail anymore. And the goal was basically to put the US rail industry on a more secure financial footing. For many of us who remember that time, the railroads were losing money, were not financially stable, were not operating. And the Staggers Act was really put in place to take away the passenger rail responsibility and shift it to what we now know as Amtrak, and provide the foundation for the railroads to recoup and get on a secure financial footing. Well, that part of the Staggers Act has been realized, where since then, service improved, rates decreased, and safety and infrastructure improved. And the whole operation or function of the Surface Transportation Board was really set up as an adjunctory body where the processes and the procedures that in place were done so to make it easier for the railroads to become financially stable and profitable. So next slide. So right now, the current STB board members are Martin Chairman. He's the Overman. He's of the Democratic Party. He was actually initially nominated by former President Trump. But when President Biden won the election, he was then named chairman of the Surface Transportation Board. Right now, the vice chairman of the Surface Transportation Board is Michelle Schultz, and the vice chairmanship of the Surface Transportation Board, it rotates on a yearly basis. The other Democratic members serving on the board right now are Robert Primus. And the newest addition to the board is Karen Headland, and she was just recently confirmed in January. And Patrick Fuchs is the other Republican member serving on the board. So next slide. So as Emily mentioned, there has been quite an awful lot of engagement with NCTA and FRCA before the Surface Transportation Board. The heightened activity for this type of engagement really started in 2019. We've had the current president of FRCA, Shelley Saling-Zart. She had actually been very active and chairman on the Surface Transportation's Rail Transportation Advisory Committee. And currently, Emily serves on the RETAC Advisory Committee, which is the Rail Energy Transportation Advisory Committee. So we've had constant presence and participation and leadership in two of the key advisory boards to the Surface Transportation Board. And then NCTA and FRCA, we have been working on behalf of our members and also with other aligned shipping groups, notably the Western Coal Traffic League, the National Industrial Transportation League, and the Private Rail Food and Beverage Association, joining efforts in terms of hearings, submitted written comments, and other proceedings on various issues. The most notable was the STB hearing on demurrage and accessoral charges. And that's when we participated in the hearing, which was way back in May 2019. And since then, and thanks to our efforts, the STB did issue new demurrage and accessoral charges policy and new billing requirements for the railroads. Groups have been, especially FRCA and WCTL and NCTA, continue to be involved in railroad revenue adequacy proceedings. We were involved in a Clean Water Act prohibition, which basically affected some of the Western states. We're always involved in cost benefit analysis. There was a petition filed by the American Association of Railroads that would require the Surface Transportation Board to utilize a greater cost benefit analysis processes in all rulemakings. And STB is an independent agency, and it already uses cost benefit analysis in its proceedings. So we've been fighting against this effort by the American Association of Railroads, for we just view it as a way of the railroads to slow down all types of regulatory proceedings moving forward. I mentioned the demurrage billing, requirements. We were also really the initiator of asking the Surface Transportation Board to collect railroad data from the railroads on first mile, last mile performance measures. The groups kind of collectively saw that there was a real problem in the fact that the current regulations don't require the railroads to report that data. And that is probably one of the most significant elements of the movement where service problems appear. And as we all know, the Surface Transportation Board, they are requiring first mile, last mile data to be reported for a 6-month period. And in fact, the STB just issued another order saying that the data and other information being reported to the board is not sufficient. So the railroads have to do a better job in this type of reporting moving forward. Another issue that the groups are actively involved is a proceeding that would give more authority to the owners of private rail cars, a little bit more authority in directing or requiring the rail carriers and how they use private rail cars. And Emily can talk a little bit more about that later. So next slide. So while we have all this activity going on at the Surface Transportation Board, specifically as it relates to the rail service problems that many of our members are experiencing, have experienced, and are continuing to experience, Capitol Hill is now engaged in these service issues in particular, and how PSR is affecting the service issues. We have had quite a bit of action, especially on the House side with the House of Representatives. For the House Railroad Subcommittee has held 2 hearings on STB reauthorization. And this is the particular piece of legislation that gives the authority for the STB to do what it can do. And the STB reauthorization actually expired 2 years ago. The Railroad Subcommittee held 2 hearings on this. FRCA was one of the freight shipper groups that was asked to submit comments on what it would like to see in an STB reauthorization. The members of the Surface Transportation Board testified before this committee, and FRCA, NCTA, and the aligned shipper groups were now working with that subcommittee on their draft STB reauthorization measure, which we anticipate that bill to be introduced fairly soon. In the Senate, there doesn't seem to be as much attention on an actual STB reauthorization. However, there continues to be increased interest, especially by Senator Baldwin, Democrat of Wisconsin, and hopefully a few Republican senator members, to try to move forward a particular piece of legislation that would clarify the statutorily definition of common carrier obligation. So shippers view the need to clarify that definition, and then combined with first mile, last mile data submissions, that those two tools in particular should be able to help the STB better provide oversight, especially when we have service problems, especially to the degree that we're seeing now. So we're kind of in a wait and see pattern in the Senate as to whether or not this particular legislation can be attached to another bill, moved separately, be combined with a House STB reauthorization if we reach that far. So we're still kind of in a holding pattern on that. And any type of movement on any issue right now is extremely difficult, mainly because we're nearing the middle of the summer. And we also have the elections in November. So there's a lot of cat and mouse game that's being played right now. So we'll just kind of have to see, what happens as we move forward. And I think that's it for me. So I'll send it back to Emily.
Well, thank you, Anne. So I'm going to talk about PSR. So when is a train wreck no accident? This image here illustrates what I think about when we talk about precision scheduled railroading, because this is something that's been coming up more and more in the discussions with the Surface Transportation Board, and that we hear from the railroads and the way they've changed their business models. And it's really resulted in a virtual train wreck with all kinds of freight rail service issues that are causing many, many problems for shippers. So sort of a timeline of events since the inception of PSR goes like this. It was about 6 years ago, the Class 1 railroads started cutting their workforce. And that resulted in about a 33% of workforce reduction prior to the pandemic of 2020. And then in early 2021, there was an increased demand for commodities of all types, and then rail labor shortages and ongoing rehiring challenges at the railroads. And then the railroad equipment shortages and lack of available locomotives, and the railroad struggling to respond to surges in demand from shippers of all kinds of things. So the supply chain issues affecting just about everything these days, and now the Surface Transportation Board is on to them. So what exactly is PSR? So it is a concept in freight rail operations that pioneered by E. Hunter Harrison of the CSX Railroad. It was in 1993. And this has been adopted by almost every Class 1 railroad since that time. And it shifts the focus to moving cars versus trains in an effort to streamline operations intended to improve cost efficiencies for the railroads, lower operating ratios, improve their system fluidity, and put limits on excess capacity, and then prioritize more profitable traffic. And the results are, and we already mentioned this, is a 30% reduction in railroad labor. Longer trains is another one, reduced track maintenance, deferred locomotive maintenance and availability, centralized decision-making for rail operations. That means the decision-making is taken away from the local operations people. And the train speeds being regulated, but to save fuel. And this has all not been a very good thing for shippers. So what are the effects of PSR on coal traffic? It's virtually eliminated any surge capacity of railroads' ability to respond to increased demand by shippers. It deprioritizes demand of inelastic traffic like coal traffic. There's no local authority allowed to address any service issues. We have labor forces leaving the railroads. They complain of poor treatment and strict penalties on attendance, and they have fears of more furloughs because a lot of them were let go prior to and during the pandemic. And then there's a focus on investor metrics and data models, not customer needs. A total difference between shipment schedules and deliveries, such as there's no control over how often and how fast you're getting your coal. And this is all resulting in a balanced disruption of coal production and coal deliveries for coal generation. And then on top of this, the railroads are showing record revenue gains against low volumes. And this is actually a recent headline that I just can't seem to forget. So what can we do about PSR? Well, there's Peppermint Patty asking what you can do when everything seems hopeless, and Snoopy says, eat a cookie. Well, this is where I have to tell you that I'm actually related to the entire Peanuts gang. We used to have a dog named Snoopy when I was growing up, and I have a brother named Charles. I have a cousin named Lucy. I also have a great aunt Frida. I have a great aunt Patty. And then I married someone named Linus. So getting back to PSR. So what can we do about PSR? Well, you can try to enforce any shipper contract rights that you might have. You can try to amend those contracts to rebalance the service and the economics, or you can make formal complaints in court or go to the STB. You can actually contact the STB Office of Customer and Public Assistance, and there's the number on the screen. And you can support NCTA and FRCA to work on your behalf to participate in the STB rulemakings, because we've actually been working really hard to represent the membership in as many proceedings that are appropriate over the last couple of years, and we feel we've really been making a difference. So there could be other ways to fight PSR, such as congressional or perhaps federal inquiries. And this has already been happening recently, and that Ann spoke about earlier. They've had some hearings at the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee, and the subcommittee's already caught on to what's going on with the railroads. And in fact, they've called out the STB members themselves on their actions or inactions to fix the service problems. And all of these are not very fast or easy remedies, but this is what you have to do. You want to make changes happen. So I'm going to let Ann talk a little more next about what the recent STB proceedings are that could help shippers. Ann, you're muted. There she is.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think it kind of gets lost in the overall spectrum as to things that are happening in Washington and how does that really affect what I do day to day to do my job, to meet my customers' responsibilities and their expectations, and to ultimately, serve the communities that we care about, live in, work in, and play in. So first of all, when we do talk about the first mile, last mile, the petition that we filed, it actually worked. And as we noted, as a follow-on to the emergency service hearing that the STB held in April, one of the items that they did require was that they issued a subsequent order requiring for the Class 1 railroads to submit their service recovery plans, their employment plans, and performance data, including first mile, last mile service. What's important about this is that this will be happening for the 6-month period. And the STB and all stakeholders will have the opportunity to look at this data that's being submitted, and then we can help the STB figure out what type of data it actually specifically needs to be requested by the railroads to submit moving forward. And I think what we're all finding is that the data and the information that the railroads present publicly is either apples to oranges, it doesn't make any sense, it's not relevant to the issue at hand, and it just is incomplete. And that's why earlier this week, the STB required those particular Class 1s to resubmit their data and paying particular attention to what was requested in the order that was issued about a month or so ago. So that is making a difference. And we also are continuing with discussions on rail service issues and performance data. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to work with the Public Assistance Office at STB, Our groups do on an informal basis, just sharing the performance with the STB and their staff, and all doing so in a confidential umbrella, because we are very, sensitive to the fact of railroad retaliation. So we present this data in the aggregate, and we present this data just to inform the STB of what's going wrong as reflected in the data, but also on occasion what is going right. So that's how we're continuing to make a difference there. As I mentioned, we're working to try to statutorily define or clarify the common carrier obligation definition. For so many times it's so vague in the Staggers Act that there really isn't a clear path as to what a common carrier obligation means. And it's also important to allow for flexibility in that what a rail carrier service is in one particular region of the country for one particular commodity may not necessarily be meeting a common carrier obligation in another part of the country or another part or another commodity. So we're just trying to work with Congress to statutorily clarify that, and then give the STB the flexibility to implement it as it sees fits when determining if and when a railroad has not met its common carrier obligation. We spent quite a bit of time over the last year being interviewed by the General Accountability Office. They were asked by the leaders of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee about a year and a half ago to do a study on the effects of PSR. We're waiting for that report to be issued anytime soon. We have been, working with our other industry stakeholders on helping persuade the STB to finish its reciprocal switching proceeding, which actually started 16 years ago. This would be an example of how the STB can hopefully instill or facilitate competition in the marketplace. And we've been working with the STB on providing expedited relief for service emergencies. As you may have noted, soon after the STB emergency service hearing, they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that would change the process for shippers seeking emergency service orders. So that hopefully will make it easier and more accessible and more timely for shippers to seek that type of relief when needed. And we've also discussed, PSR. It is the common theme in everything that we state. And we, as Emily noted earlier, PSR resulted in over a 30% reduction in rail labor workforce prior to the pandemic. So we're constantly saying that these decisions were made prior to the pandemic, and the COVID-19 situation just escalated the severity of the results of PSR, especially in rail labor. And again, working with the STB in a proceeding to give certain paths or procedures for owners of private rail cars to work with the railroads in terms of how the railroads use their equipment. So I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So I want to talk in depth about the ex parte 768 petition. This is rules governing private rail car usage by railroads. And this one came out last summer, and we supported it. NCTA and FRCA have supported this petition seeking a new rulemaking. And the idea behind this petition is to create a rulemaking proceeding that would provide appropriate financial incentives for the Class 1 railroads to utilize private rail cars more efficiently. NCTA and FRCA are organizations whose members own and lease a lot of heavy rolling stock, and that represents a huge financial investment, and that's all provided to the railroads at no cost to them. But there's no incentive for the railroads to handle that equipment efficiently. So we've been asking for some sensible policies to provide reasonable protection for the shippers' huge capital investment in rail cars. And the STB is seeking comments on this rulemaking by the end of June this month. At our NCTA Operations and Maintenance Committee meeting last week, we gathered some really good information from our utility equipment owners roundtable discussion. So we'll be putting that to use in our comments. And so lastly, I want to talk about that two-day hearing that took place at the STB at the end of April. They titled it Urgent Issues in Freight Rail Service. And so to illustrate this, Urgent Issues in Freight Rail Service, I think about this movie, perhaps you know of it. It's called Stand By Me. If you know the film, these kids go off on this journey to try to find a dead body they've heard about. And they're walking along the railroad tracks on a one-lane railroad trestle bridge, and a freight train comes barreling down on them. And there's Vern, who won't get up off the tracks. So that's what I call a very urgent issue. And it's kind of how I see the situation of the rail service problems right now. So at this hearing, NCTA was very well represented. John Ward presented testimony on behalf of NCTA. I testified on behalf of my own company, APCO. Ann Warner spoke on behalf of FRCA, and there were probably over 30 shippers or shipper organizations that provided testimony over the two-day period. And the Class 1 railroads were also there, and there were several rail labor representatives as well. And out of this hearing, the STB ordered the 4 Class 1 railroads to submit rail service recovery plans and service metrics. And they're also supposed to be meeting with the STB on a regular basis. And so since that time, the first set of reporting metrics have been received by the STB. And Chairman Marty Oberman was reported as saying to another shipper group that so far he's extremely disappointed with the service plans filed, and that the information so far was a woeful and frankly insulting effort. And so we understand that staff are still working to try to figure out how to deal with all the railroad data and present it to the public. But then as of June 13th, this week, the STB issued another decision directing the Class 1 railroads to correct the deficiencies in the rail service recovery plans. And Ann mentioned this earlier. Marty again was quoted as saying that the recovery plans were woefully deficient. So he sent them back to the drawing board on this. And so another key issue that we want to watch, and that kind of came out of that hearing in April, is the need for a more clear definition of the railroad common carrier obligation, clear language to that effect, to be included in future decisions and possibly in the draft language for that upcoming STB reauthorization bill. In fact, we're working on all of this right now. So one thing you have to keep in mind, and for sure, NCTA and FRCA, we're going to stay engaged in all of these issues, and we're going to continue to ask for continued STB oversight on these recovery plans, and as shippers seek help on their rail service issues. So that's the end of my slides. I'll turn it back to John at this point.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Ann. Very complete overview. We'll open it for questions to anyone. If you'd like to unmute and chime in, you're welcome to do that, or send us a message in the chat box, which is another easy way to send in any questions that you might have. I wanted to make just a couple of comments on the presentation. First of all, I'd like to highlight that Emily and Ann were probably being a little bit too modest on their involvement in terms of the first mile, last mile proceeding. In that hearing in April that went on. By the way, the emergency service hearing that went on in April went for 19 hours over 2 days. All 5 commissioners sat for the whole thing. Every commodity group in the country was there and was complaining about similar issues that they are having. The STB is kind of a dry body, but their televised hearings usually attract about 1,000 views on YouTube. This one had over 120,000 views on YouTube. So it's just a huge concern across commodity types right now. And Ann and Emily were specifically recognized by Chairman Oberman during the hearing for their early involvement on this first mile, last mile issue. that has now made its way into the orders that the STB is giving to the railroads as far as reporting. So, you know, kudos to Emily and Ann for the work that they've done in that area. Actually, one of the questions we just had come in, if someone doesn't know what first mile, last mile means, could you explain that? Emily, maybe you could take that question.
Yeah, I'll do my best, and Ann can chime in as well. First mile, last mile really has to do with the delivery of your rail cars to your facility at the delivery point. Railroads service manifest traffic and coal traffic in slightly different ways, whereas they may be staging rail cars at a certain point before they bring them into a facility. They track that performance differently than as if you would be tracking actually receiving those rail cars. If you're not actually receiving the cars in a timely manner, they are not going to be delivering them to you except in bunches, or you know, be waiting for certain days where they're going to be delivering the manifest traffic. Coal traffic doesn't really see first mile, last mile so much. We're just operating in unit trains. But what's helpful about the first mile, last mile petition is that this is going to be holding the railroads accountable for their entire delivery performance metric. Ann, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, what I'll add is it's a really good question, because what we have found in this whole service meltdown and with the reporting of what the railroads are doing right now to the STB, and then when you look at the service updates that the rail carriers send to their customers on a regular basis, even the railroads don't really measure first mile, or don't really consider first mile, last mile consistently. And we've seen, some instances where a railroad will say that it met its first mile, last mile obligation or requirement by dropping the car off at the switch, but then not taking the extra steps to get the car to the shipper's facility, which may be 75 miles away. Or they believe that they've met their first mile, last mile requirements based upon what their estimated service delivery schedule is. Well, the railroads can oftentimes change their estimated times of arrival without you even knowing it as a shipper. So this exercise is also showing the differences in how the railroads are seeing it and measuring and capturing it and measuring it, and how it does or does not align with what the shipper is actually experiencing at the first or last mile end of the journey. And the shipper, can identify and measure and define what first mile, last mile is different than what the railroads do. So that's kind of what we're experiencing and why it's so important.
Those are great responses, and I'll just add to that. If you look at the kind of data that the railroads are fond of reporting, it's all train velocity and average speed, and things that represent metrics of how the trains are doing, sort of in between pickup and delivery. But they don't do a good job of measuring, did we pick it up on time? Did we deliver it on time? And that's really at the core of what this first mile, last mile is trying to do, is not just look at how fast it's moving while it's on the main line, but are you actually getting your stuff picked up? Are you actually getting your goods delivered when they say that they're going to deliver it to you? So that's
right. One way I can add to your illustration, John, is like so many of us fly, and it's fine if the pilot says that our airspeed is going to be 550 miles per hour. Well, okay. But does it really matter to me how fast we're going in the air if I have to, wait to board? If I board and then I have to wait to be pushed off, or I'm waiting on the tarmac or the taxiway, or I land, and there's no gate available, or there is a gate available, but there's no people to move the gate to the plane. So that's kind of another analogy of how the railroads just focus on their velocity. Well, okay, but what does that mean at the beginning of the trip and at the end of the trip?
Yeah, exactly. So appreciate that. Again, reminding folks, questions can be submitted in the chat box or just jump into the conversation here. We did have a question on, can you give us a template or a format of a typical comment that a utility would submit for the use of private rail car issue? Let me jump in with a couple of things. One thing that would be helpful is NCTA's website has an archive of all of the comments that NCTA has participated in over the past 3+ years in these activities. You go to movecoal.org, click on the publications tab on the top, and you'll see a sub tab for position papers. So that's movecoal.org, publications tab, position papers. And you can see all of the filings that we've done in all of these matters that Emily and Ann have gone through today. And that kind of fits the template. With regard to the private rail car use deadline that is coming up at the end of this month, we've done some previous filings supporting the position. One of them is available on the website there. But I think what we're looking for in the next filing is some very specific information. As Emily mentioned at our O&M conference a week or two ago, we picked up a lot of information on how the railroads are using different systems for tracking and condemning rail cars and things like that. So the more specific we can get as possible, and we're also happy if utilities are going to prepare their own individual responses. We're happy to help you review drafts of those or provide input. And we would also love to hear from anybody who's got material that we can put into our filing. So this will be the big project for the next 2 weeks, is pulling this together. So if you've got specific issues, I encourage you to get a hold of either Emily or myself, and we'll make sure that all of our comments are coordinated and we get all the information that's out there. Question from the group: have the railroads been asked to provide actual attrition and workforce data? Yeah, the answer is yes. Ann or Emily, you can put some more color on that.
Yes, I mean, they have been asked to provide that, especially as a part of this most recent data reporting order. And one of the items that the chairman and the board are just completely dissatisfied with is their lack of this particular data that's been provided to date. So yes, they were asked to provide it, and hopefully they will.
It's interesting too. There's been a lot of focus on because the current meltdown of the rail service has been attributed to a lack of engineers and conductors. There's also been a growing focus on trying to get the railroads to show what's going on in other parts of the organization, because they're not just suffering labor issues in the train sets, but they're losing IT people. They're losing many of you would realize they're losing customer service people. So the labor issues. And now, in the news this week, we may be staring down the barrel of a strike because longstanding labor negotiations between the railroads and their labor unions are pretty broken down at this point, and the labor unions are going through the beginning steps of what it would take to go on strike. So that issue of getting visibility of the railroad data to figure out how they're going to solve their labor issues is something the STB is laser focused on, but so far they haven't had a lot of success there.
John, if I could jump in, there was a question that was presented to me earlier during some of my remarks I'd like to address for the group. The question was asked, what type of examples or illustrations can you provide of railroad retaliation? And I will say that railroad retaliation is a real concern among all shippers. And it can come in different ways, different forms, different measures. It can appear if a railroad learns that a particular shipper customer has had discussions with the STB, informal discussions with their U.S. senator or their U.S. House of or their U.S. congressman in Congress about railroad service problems, and if that gets back to that particular railroad, sometimes railroad retaliation can be something like a simple phone call, like, I've heard that you guys were talking to the STB about a problem at, X facility. There's no reason for you to go to the STB about that. You really shouldn't have done that. You should just talk to me about it directly and we'll get it taken care of. Well, of course that doesn't work. So a shipper has every right to go to the STB to informally raise concerns or to get suggestions from the STB on how to address it or how to handle it. Other forms of retaliation can be if you do have contract movements. Maybe your contract is up for renegotiation. Railroad can be very difficult in working with you and what your contract terms are going to be. If you do move under tariff, which of course falls to STB jurisdiction, they could, give you an unimaginable tariff increase. There's just little ways that railroad retaliation can pop up, and it's not necessarily immediate. So it could also be down the road. So that's why shippers really look to groups like NCTA, FRCA, NRECA, Western Coal Traffic League, PERFBA, Knit League, National Food and Grain, corn refineries. I mean, all of these groups to try to give some protection and some insulation to its members when trying to deal with these issues. However, I would caution that there is time and there is a need when individual shippers need to step up and need to document and share what their problems are. And this happened with demurrage, and this is happening right now with the service problem. So it's kind of a catch as to what you all are comfortable with. And sometimes, sometimes these activities do get picked up in the press, and also what is your tolerance for being in a news story on a particular day. Mm-hmm. And I would add that earlier in the year, there was some activity in the Senate Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over the Surface Transportation Board. And they were considering several supply chain pieces of legislation. And there was one particular bill relating to ports where 4 amendments were offered to that particular bill. And one amendment would have strengthened existing statutory prohibitions against railroad retaliation. And we worked with, it was sponsored by Senator Baldwin from Wisconsin, and we worked with her on that language. For the amendment, it included a whole array of strengthening existing prohibitions, penalties, fines, repercussions, and it also expanded the types of activities that would be considered railroad retaliation. Of course, it didn't go very far, but at least the effort was made, and that gave another opportunity to educate at least senators on that committee what railroad retaliation actually is. And I would note that the Federal Maritime Commission, which is another independent agency which has jurisdiction over ocean shipping, it actually has really strong statutory prohibitions against against ocean shipping retaliation. So there may be a way that we could kind of look at the FMC and what their authority is and how that might be applied to the Surface Transportation Board moving forward too.
Great, thanks, Ann. We're getting down toward the end. Emily, do you have one more comment here?
I just had one more quick thing. Is that's one reason why we have the on-time performance survey, is because your identity is protected and you're providing your own data which the STB needs to really be able to understand what is actually going on, because the railroad data is so confusing. But your data, the shipper data, is actually your entire round trip service metrics. And that is a very clear and easily explainable and understood information. And then also there's one last question here that somebody sent to me, and maybe Ann, you know, can shippers get a hold of the railroad recovery plans that were submitted to the STB? Is that public?
Yes, it is public. Excuse me. It is public on the STB website, and we can find the docket number, and we can send that to the participants as to how to access that.
Great, thank you. And one other question that came through was whether the railroads, as part of those service recovery plans, are being asked to provide equipment data like locomotives returning to service. And yes, that is supposed to be part of their reporting as well. So that's all there. We're coming up on the top of the hour. We want to be sensitive to everybody's time. Just real quickly, a little shameless self-promotion here. We do encourage everybody. We appreciate all the NCTA members who are here supporting us today. We appreciate others for coming in. We're going to be doing some membership drive activity this summer that will be very helpful. We have a lot of great programs, webinars like this one. We have a scholarship program. The deadline for the scholarship program, this is for any members of families of NCTA member companies. So we've got some promotional material you can put up in your lunchrooms and send around to your human resources departments and so forth. We've given out over $350,000 over the years, and deadline is July 31st now. Also, I'd like to remind everybody our annual business meeting and conference is coming up in September at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver, September 12th through 14th. So please mark your calendars and get ready for that. Emily will be coming back out with us on the next round of the on-time performance survey. We'll be going out in a couple of months to gather data from the first half of 2022. We appreciate all of those of you who have participated in the past and invite those of you who haven't to join in. This has been one of the most useful bits of information in working with the STB and the policymakers on Capitol Hill. So we appreciate your performance there, or your participation there. And finally, if you every other week, the On Track newsletter comes out in your inbox. If you're not getting it, get in touch with us. It's free. It has a lot of news rundowns and updates on topics like we've been talking about today. So we encourage you, if you're not seeing that in your inbox, get a hold of me or Melinda, and we'll make sure that you're on the list, or help your IT department solve that crazy spam folder thing. So with that in mind, we're 1 minute to 11. Again, thank you so much, Emily. Thank you so much, Ann, for all the work that you do for the industry, but also for your time in bringing us up to speed today. And we appreciate everyone's participation. Our next webinar will be in the July timeframe. We're going to do a little election preview about energy and politics. And so watch your inbox for some promotion for that webinar that'll be coming up this summer. So thanks everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.